What I want to do tonight is tell you some of the ways in which our church community has responded to housing needs and issues, ways we're hoping to respond in the future, and some of the inspiration or vision behind these responses. I want to tell you a little bit about the process of how these responses have emerged, not so that you'll do the same things we've done. I wouldn't even want to do all the same things we've done, certainly not all the mistakes we've made, but to spark your imagination to respond in creative, holistic ways in the neighborhoods that you are part of. In one sense, I believe our housing crisis in part comes from a failure of imagination and courage at the individual, communal, and systemic levels. So I trust that all of us will have our imaginations stretched tonight. Over the past 25 years at Grandview, we have seen a faith community that was ready to die, experience renewal, and become a vital community engaged in its neighborhood in multiple ways. Along the way, and with a lot of messy maturation, we have recovered a parish vision for the good of our neighborhood. And during those years, we've kept pursuing an alternative kind of world in which described in the story of Jesus, where the poor are lifted up, those held in bondage to personal and systemic powers are released, where people learn to love God and each other. And this has led us to develop such responses as a weekly meal and shelter, a social enterprise developer called Just Work, Kinbrace support for refugee claimants, Mums, a group for many single mothers in our neighborhood, Read, an organization that works on policy and care for those trafficked in the sex trade, and also Streams of Justice, an activist group, as well as Still Point, an urban retreat space and a place for healing. And we're not large either. We're two congregations of about 300 people total, so you don't have to be large to do something. And one of the primary responses we have made comes in this area of housing and homes. One of our first responses was to begin a weekly meal and shelter called Out of the Cold. So for over 17 years, we've had a meal with folks in the neighborhood who live on or near the street that for 10 years included overnight stay for up to 30 people. Two stories of how this came to be. One is a Christmas dinner begun by two women almost 20 years ago, both of whom came out of backgrounds of poverty, and which opened our eyes to the need for a good meal for many in our neighborhood. And the second story is about a meeting at a local neighborhood area services team meeting, where I was asked by one of the members of the Kettle Society what we were doing for the increasing number of homeless people on Commercial Drive. And I said nothing that I know of, and brought that story back to our church that Sunday, and invited whoever wanted to come to discuss it. And 6 months later, after some research, planning, and church discussion, we started Out of the Cold, something which 10th Church and later First Baptist also began. Now, if we stop there at this level of emergency response, if that was our only response, you might argue that we're actually perpetuating the problem by making it easier for public and government not to provide permanent housing and to deal with homelessness at a systemic level. Only providing emergency shelters, like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that really needs major surgery. I mean, who wants to live in a shelter the rest of their lives? Would you? Could you? Is it right that anyone should do that? But there's a reason for emergency shelters, because you do need a place to stay now if you are on the street. And to the city's credit, they have provided more shelter, making our shelter beds less necessary. One reason our community meal has continued to be important, however, is it has become one of those third spaces so necessary for community building. Neutral spaces where people can develop relationships across socioeconomic boundaries and build trust, so that we might welcome people into our homes, especially those that are more vulnerable. That's been the mission of Salisbury Community Society. Salisbury began when a group of people looked at forming a community together and buying a local seniors' home with the help of a foundation. When the city required seismic upgrading with the proposed change of use, the financial viability of that project, the project fell through. It was all right if the building fell down on seniors, but not on young adults. No, just kidding. Those of you involved in urban planning know it's not a lot more complicated than that. And I want to thank all the people involved in urban planning. All my experience has been that people are there really trying to make a difference in the city. After that letdown, we were saddened, but we met together to grieve that loss, only to meet someone who offered us a new vision, a vision of clustered housing, community houses in geographical proximity to one another. We began with 2 houses adjacent to our church building, and Salisbury Community Society was formed. And over the last 19 years, many others have observed, participated in, and taken this vision of community living and community houses further. Some people rent together, some people have purchased homes together, and we're trying to live more hospitably in those contexts. And while part of this community living is indeed driven by economics, it's also motivated by a vision to develop a thicker shared life together in a culture of individualism and loneliness. This has been our own family's journey over the last 25 years. We started with a couple from Latin America who needed a space, and they stayed with us for 1.5 years. Then a woman who was going through a depression and a divorce needed a place for a weekend, and she stayed 1.5 years. And then a single mom and her son who had a bad landlord who would come into her apartment unannounced, moved in with us for 2 weeks and stayed 1.5 years. You get the picture. After 1.5 years, people don't like us anymore, and they move out. Actually, living with others is a great way to discover your strengths and flaws. After we had a woman going through rehab and her daughter lived with us for another 3 months, we said, we can do this. We can be intentional about inviting people to live with us. And we counted up our housemates that we've shared a home with over the years, and we've had 46 people live with us over the past 20 years, from 3 months to 5 years. Someone says that one of Vancouver's main problems is not a lack of housing, but too many empty bedrooms. 2 houses where the bedrooms are filled all the time are at Kinbrace. Kinbrace began 18 years ago when Lauren and Tam Ward-Beliski had a dream of providing a home and support for refugee claimants. Kinbrace is 2 houses side by side with 10 suites where refugee claimants, those making a claim for protection within our borders, are welcome to live until the outcome of their refugee claim, with an average stay of about 6 months. About 400 people, some of the most vulnerable in our world, have found a landing spot and a welcome at Kinbrace. In all of this, one of the most important stories that has continued to challenge us to make room for people who need housing comes from Luke's gospel and Luke's story of the great banquet. In that text, Jesus tells a story to explain why he's throwing these parties all over Palestine and inviting all the wrong guests. And the story is about a person hosting a great banquet. He works his network and he invites all the high rollers and hipsters in Palestine to come to the party, and they all turn him down. And then he drops that and he invites whoever needs a meal. Jesus gives this challenge in that parable. When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or your sisters, your relatives or your rich neighbors. If you do, they might invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. That vision has challenged, stretched, infuriated, and inspired us over the years. Jean Vanier, the founder of large communities around the world where physically and mentally challenged people live alongside other folks, wrote this modern ending to that parable. And by the way, his book, Community and Growth, is an invaluable book if you live together with others, since he helps you to face your own stuff, one of the gifts and ongoing requirements of living with others. And in this book, he imparts this vision for the church. He says this: in years to come, we are going to need many small communities which will welcome lost and lonely people, offering them a new form of family and a sense of belonging. In the past, Christians who wanted to follow Jesus opened hospitals and schools. Now that there are many of these, Christians must commit themselves to these new communities of welcome, to live with people who have no other family, and to show them that they are loved and can grow to greater freedom, and that they, in turn, can love and give life to others. So a question for you: are you called to open up your home, or to buy a home together that makes room for those with less income, or to consider opening your home to a refugee family? It's been encouraging to see the widespread hospitality offered in our city for Syrian refugees. Those then are some of the individual and corporate responses we have made with regard to housing over the years. One we are getting ready to launch in the future is the Cohere project. And let me tell you about that story. 14 years ago, we purchased the lot adjacent to our church parking lot with the intention of moving our drop-in center into that particular house. We had a bad inspection at the time of purchase, and we soon came to realize that not only would that house be unsuitable for our drop-in center, but we needed to tear the house down. And that began a long journey, these things can take a while, towards developing a housing project called Cohere, Community Here. A visioning process in that time resulted in a commitment to use that land for housing. An initial partnership with a housing group to develop it followed that. Later, there was a decision to develop the land ourselves with our own partner groups who were growing in capacity over that time. And now a final fundraising effort to make this sustainable project, which is why I'm glad you brought your credit cards with you tonight. Have I got a deal for you? Well, what does this project look like? Well, the Cohere project involves building underground parking for the church, a floor of community space which involves retaining a community garden that has flourished on that lot, 26 units of housing structured in 4 hubs, where 6 or so independent units open up into a common living room. And we have folks from Cohere Foundation and Salisbury Community Society who will operate this home here tonight with pictures, and you've got some here, and these awesome bags to sell right here. So there you go. There's your bag. Drop by after and chat with them. We're really excited about this project for a number of reasons. One, it's the first time we've been able to design the architecture to facilitate community, and architecture matters in building community. Second, we asked people living on or near the street what they would want in housing, and we've been able to develop and design something that they have offered us, resulting in a project we trust will be a good home. And thirdly, we've continued our vision of bringing people together across socioeconomic boundaries. And that means setting aside units for people who will live alongside others with limited incomes, with the intention of creating a sign of a reconciling community that Jesus described in this parable, where we cross these boundaries and share life together and participate in mutual transformation. Fourthly, we're excited about this project because we believe that it can be something of a model for other faith communities to motivate them to use their parking lots and land assets to build affordable housing. Not only could building housing over top of parking lots belonging to churches, temples, and synagogues be a way to respond to this housing crisis, it can be a way for those communities to reroute in their neighborhoods and reconnect with their neighbors. If you're part of a church with a considerable land assets or a parking lot, please consider how you can use these assets for the social good, and especially for housing. Talk to folks from Cohere, talk to Joan or to Robert. Begin to imagine and dream. That's how it all starts. Can you imagine if the church in Vancouver took up this challenge? And can you imagine what a change in perception it might bring to the value of churches in our city if we did this? So those are some of the individual and corporate responses we have made, but again, this is not enough. With prices having jumped $100,000 or so for a single detached home in East Vancouver this fall, we need to be working at systemic change at a political level, as Joan said. Letting the market have its way in creating a city that is unaffordable for the majority of the population is not acceptable. As churches, we have an opportunity to flex our collective muscle by working together at this level with each other and with all citizens. You know, we as a church are currently working on a housing proposal that includes ideas at the systemic level, such as engaging in our local area community plans, supporting a progressive property transfer tax. It's really David's idea, one that comes from London and Hong Kong and other places where it has been successful in suppressing prices. And also working with others to challenge our federal government to establish a housing program, something that we abandoned 22 years ago and never have replaced. There is a dearth of social housing in this country. and much of what remains will no longer be usable in some years. These responses shift our perception of housing from merely being a commodity to becoming a basic need for all people. And this, it seems to me, is indeed part of the mission of God, who wants everyone to have a place to call home. I believe it's vital that we as churches are engaging multiple options for creating a more livable city at all these levels, the individual level, the communal level, and the systemic level. In a world where there's a growing vacuum between the individual on one side and the market and state on the other, the church has the opportunity to join other groups in that in-between space that German philosopher Jürgen Habermas describes as being key to creating a better society. This crisis in affordability calls us to enter this space as churches in new ways and to creatively mediate these forces and work for a more affordable and livable city. The question is, will we do it? Will we step into that space? 50 years ago, most people thought that racism in the U.S. between blacks and whites was here to stay, an intractable problem. But then a man named Martin Luther King Jr. came along with a dream, and he said he believed that the power of Christ's love was greater than the power of hate. And a move began and change began that few people had foreseen. It seems to me that we are being called to believe that the power of Christ to love our neighbor, especially our neighbor in need of housing, is greater than the power of greed. And it is time to put our bodies and mouths and bank accounts on the line in the way that MLK and the civil rights movement did. It's time as churches, individuals, and as society to say that we won't treat housing anymore merely as a commodity, but we will recognize that it is a basic human need. It's time to follow the way of the one who gave up his home and laid down his life for the least among us. It's time. But are we ready to take action? Are you ready to take action? Thank you.